I just had lunch the other day with Harriet Pearl. She's 80 years old. And I taught with her. She was the one that sort of showed me the ropes when I started teaching in '62. This brilliant woman. When she became a teacher back in the 30s, because the vast majority of women had no place to go other than education or nursing or secretarial work, there was a captive pool of tremendous talent for very low wages. Well, when women started being doctors and lawyers and getting their MBAs, suddenly America lost that pool of exceptional talent. You're not getting the Harriet Pearls anymore for low wages. I taught economics for years, supply and demand. When supply is low and demand is high, the price goes up. Well, we got addicted to Neiman Marcus quality for Kmart prices. But if you want talented, quality teachers, you have to pay for them.
You know, when you sit down and start talking about all of this, we've done a lot. It's been incredible what has happened. And almost 90% of what has happened, we have been on the defense. But most of the time, we've come out victoriously. And it's because we have teachers who care and will stand up and say it. And will work under adverse circumstances, in the classroom, out of the classroom, wherever they're needed.
It was 1863. The country was embroiled in civil war. Education was not a top priority. Only a few hundred students attended public schools. Teachers were poorly prepared and received meager wages of no more than $50 a month. School Superintendent John Sweat convened a teachers' meeting to address these issues.
Well, the history of CTA is very interesting. It was started by school administrators. Their cause was actually very noble. It was to get more funding for public schools.
Back then, it was all rural education. So they were trying to develop a public school system that would best meet the needs of these kids who live far away from large cities. They divided the state into 6 sections. And each of the sections had their own governance structure, their own board of directors. And they operated in that fashion up until 1971. Mostly men. It wasn't until later on that they admitted women. And for a while, private school teachers could belong to the society as well.
Because San Francisco Bay Area teachers and administrators primarily ran CTA, regional teachers associations were formed throughout the state. Recognizing that the only way to get significant education reform is through legislation, CTA soon formed an advisory council, or State Council of Education.
But it was run by a group of white male school superintendents. That was the California Teachers Association. It should have been called the California Administrators Association, because that's really what it was.
When I first became a teacher, this was typical. One of the questions asked me by the person interviewing me was, would I join the local teachers association? It was a condition of work. And it was run by administrators in the districts.
They prided themselves on being the professional organization as opposed to the AFT, which was the bad union.
I thought that if the organization was blessed with the membership of the very important people, the administrators, it must be a fine group for teachers to belong to. But I didn't realize it was more like a country club, and I was a caddy.
And in the 60s, the administrators put together a state council of teachers, and that was the end for the administrative control of California Teachers Association, because once they put together an organ of teachers within the organization, it was only a matter of time until the teachers took it over and threw the administrators out.
The 1929 stock market crash brought bad times to public education. Teachers' salaries were reduced. School funds were drained to help the unemployed. The legislature mounted numerous attacks to remove due process rights for teachers. Students left school to help support their families.
I think the Depression made people really understand how important school was. My father, for example, dropped out during the Depression to get a job. And even though he was a high school dropout, and so was my mother, they both had this tremendous desire that I go to school because education was really important. And for me, that was a benefit that I derived from my parents being denied an education in the Depression.
We have so many new teachers that have no clue about the battles we've fought. Now, my mother was a public school teacher in California, as was my grandmother. This is my mother's school bell from her first school, Forks of Salmon in Northern California in 1940. And my mother retired after 27 years, and her pension today is $407. That's not true for teachers retiring today because we've made the difference. We fought for state teacher retirement system.
And California Teachers has been in the forefront of awareness of diverse cultures. I was one of the early employees of one of the sections. I was in Southern Section. When I got out of City College, I had finished a secretarial course, and the employment office said, oh, we have an opening for a secretary at California Teachers Association. This was 1947, right after the war, when people were still not sure whether the reaction to Japanese would be favorable or not. And she said, I'm sure that CTA would be a good place for you to work. I was hired by Dr. Arthur Corey before he became executive secretary of the entire California Teachers Association.
CTA was virtually the only major organization that came out and spoke out against the Japanese internment here in California after World War II started. I mean, I think our members need to know that.
After World War II, I finished my education at San Francisco State and started teaching in 1949. In the 30s and 40s, many of the teachers thought of themselves as purely professional. But at the end of World War II, a number of former GIs got into teaching. We became a more vocal group that wanted their share of the pie.
Public schools faced a brighter future after World War II. Servicemen returned home and attended college on the GI Bill.
I began teaching in Los Angeles in 1950. After I'd been teaching for a while, we were expecting our first child. And I had to borrow money from my father to get my wife out of the hospital. And it began to soak in on me at that time that really we weren't doing very well when it came to fringe benefits. And we decided we liked teaching, so we wanted to do something about it. And I think that was a beginning of the modern day teacher activism. Then it flourished, of course, into the 60s.
The peace and tranquility of the 50s gave way to turbulence in the 60s. Urban locals were growing more powerful. There was a growing demand for improvement and protection of teachers' civil and human rights.
When I came in 60, I would say a majority of my colleagues had a second job.
It's very important for adults to feel like adults. It's very important for professionals to feel like professionals. If they don't, then it's very difficult for them to work with their students and demand that they act responsibly. When I started teaching, I qualified for food stamps. Obviously, that was not going to in any way make my profession seem a profession.
I was a teacher for 8 years before I came to the staff. I became dissatisfied with the way that the Board of Education were treating people in my district. And that was before we could do anything but just sort of go before the board members and sort of beg for what we wanted.
We were engaged what was called hat in hand. You would appear once a year at the board and plead that you need money. And the board, in their infinite wisdom, would sit and deliberate and then give you a couple % raise and say, now go away and be happy. So in '65, they introduced a bill into the California legislature, and it provided for proportional bargaining.
It was meet and confer. What happened was just meet and defer, because the power actors who had control of our lives, would sit there with these little things in the ear, listen to a radio, and they were knitting and doing all these kinds of things, and you're trying to talk to them about your livelihood. It was despicable.
It took us a long time to grow up and mature as a profession, because we had been programmed into believing that patriotism and dedication were substitutes for pay and recognition.
I started teaching in 1962, and in the 60s, the two locals in Los Angeles merged into one and formed the United Teachers of Los Angeles, which I became a charter member of. And immediately they went on strike, and we had a 23-day strike, which I think the majority of teachers took part in.
They were orderly. They were disciplined. They were dedicated to educational progress, not disruption.
I think teachers became more militant as they saw what was happening to the schools, how programs were being taken away that were vital to the education of the children. We weren't sure what was going to happen when we asked the teachers to walk out, but they knew that we were in this together. And if we were going to make some changes, we had to stick our necks out and become more vocal and actually walk out of the schools as a last resort.
Everybody was just kind of scared. And we had to say, the principals can't hurt you. They don't have as much power as you think they have.
Alvia Barfield, President-elect of the California Teachers Association, Southern Section.
All of this air conditioning would be beautiful out in the valley.
What we had to do is say to teachers not to accept what they were getting.
September 18th, 1969. Teachers in Los Angeles.
The 70s ushered in an era of struggle, change, and laws that would redefine the teaching profession and CTA. The sections were dissolved, and CTA became a unified state organization.
I taught 33 years in Jefferson School District, but we were not listened to. So our teachers in Daly City went out on the picket line, 227 of us. And 227 teachers were fired. The first time in the United States teachers were fired for striking. When we got our notice that we were fired, it's like the bottom drops out of you. It really hits you right here. And you're scared. You're really scared. The thing you had was the other teachers. You're walking side by side with people who are so dedicated. One of our favorite pictures, Jose Calmner Scott Barbara Davies. Her kids are hugging her, and she's walking out of her classroom to the picket line. I'm very, very proud to be part of the labor union movement among the teachers. We're just as important as Detroit and Chicago and Haymarket Square and all of the other people who put themselves on the line. And that's what our teachers did.
Compton has been on a lot of strikes. A lot of them have to do with basically the same thing, lack of respect. If you don't treat us right, we'll close the schools down.
And we can.
I had just come off the sit-ins I was a freedom rider, so we weren't scared because most of us had been through hell.
We had to show them that
we showed them.
We meant business, and we were educators, and we want to be respected as educators.
But all day we picketed. We never stopped. You know, a lot of us got to be friends on the line. We were just glad it was over.
19 days.
19 days. We were glad it was over. Every superintendent that's ever been to this district, ever since 1973, knows that teachers in Compton will go out if they have to go out. I mean, we don't believe now that we need to strike like we did, you know, but at that time, that was the only way people would listen.
About that time, CTA was on a course where they knew they were going to have to embrace bargaining.
Teachers were, at that time, not too interested in collective bargaining. What are you going to do that for? All you're going to do is to make these people mad, and we won't get anything.
They had this, I am very professional, you know. And I sort of told them, you know, I can be just as professional on $2 million as I can be on 200. Maybe a little more professional.
Alvea Barfield was truly a visionary. Back in the days when collective bargaining was taboo among teachers, and a lot of, the old administrative types really did not embrace collective bargaining. So I'm sure the first time she mentioned it, it was not received very warmly.
I just said, you know, things aren't going to be any more like they were. And we're going into collective bargaining. Everybody said, oh my God, collective bargaining.
And they more or less put a plague sign on her like she was some kind of militant or crazy. And I suspect for that period of time she was.
At that time, there was the beginning of a quiet movement in the teacher ranks. People who wanted to be a union.
In April 1970, the state organization formed the negotiations department, and John Donaldson was the manager of it, and John got the authority to hire a person effective August 1 of 70, and that was me. We knew that our task was to get a collective bargaining law in California, and that's what we did.
We went on a kind of a 2-year thing that we call the road show. And we went over every stick and trail in this state, visiting teachers in their classroom, telling them that we are going to have to do something better. Well, as a result of many, many people doing that, we got a collective bargaining law.
Numerous teacher strikes occurred across the state before Governor Jerry Brown finally signed the RADA Act, which gave public employees in California true collective bargaining. Because of the nature of collective bargaining, the RADA Act forced administrators out of CTA. If the 70s were an era of change, the 80s were a decade of budget tightening and economic plight for schools. Proposition 13 forced program cuts and thousands of teacher layoffs.
Prop 13 passed in June 1978. I remember it well because it was the day I was sworn in as president of my local chapter. I can remember being very, very happy, and then it was just dark.
And we slipped from being up in the top 10 in the amount of money we pay per student down to sometimes clear down at the bottom.
We were very, very desperate. And so the compromise was SB 813. It infused a huge amount of money into the public schools. It also increased the number of days that teachers taught. But CTA was the one that pushed to make sure that with the longer day, longer year, there was the money to go with it.
In 1988, CTA rescued public schools by drafting and passing Proposition 98, the state constitutional amendment which guaranteed at least 40% of the state budget to K through 14 education.
Every decision that affects a classroom is fundamentally a political decision. For us to effectively represent the interest of teachers, we have to engage in political and legislative activity. There is no way to address the factors that teachers are dealing with in the classroom without representing them in the bodies that make those decisions. That's what we do in this department.
Good morning, Council.
State Council is a group of teachers who are elected to speak for the needs of teachers. It sets policy. It also determines which legislation we will support, which legislation we need to oppose. The 30-minute duty-free lunch, which is now part of the Ed Code and has been part of the Ed Code for years, was a motion from the Sacramento City Teachers Association that moved its way through State Council and became legislation.
So we've increased salaries, we have health insurance, we have vision insurance, we have dental.
It was because of CTA that we have kindergartens. It was because of CTA that teachers enjoy duty-free lunch. It's because of CTA that we have our due process rights that teachers have.
A second-year teacher near Bakersfield was the center of a landmark decision which established the rights of probationary teachers to participate in union activities without fear of retaliation.
I was a journalism teacher, McFarland School District, and I had a student who wrote an article about negotiations. And the superintendent called the school about why are those students writing about such a subject. They didn't want to come right out and do anything illegal like tell me, no, you cannot print it. But they were trying to put pressure on me so that I would do it. And I didn't accept the pressure, and so I just printed it. And it was all within just a couple of weeks that I had my evaluation and I was terminated. It was really traumatic. It's devastating. It was hard on my family too. My youngest son wanted to be the editor of his junior high school paper, and his teacher told him, we can't have any radicals like you be the editor of your school paper. Yes, and it was interesting when we went through the court process, the superintendent testified. He says, our children in McFarland can't write, so they shouldn't have had a newspaper anyway. I did regret doing it. That year I was out of work. It was very, very difficult. And then my own children were feeling the effects of it. However, both of my boys are school teachers now, and they certainly know that they'd better be strong union members so that they'll always have some support if they should ever get in trouble as well.
Here's a bright idea. Let's allow anyone who can round up 25 kids to open a voucher school.
CTA solidified its position as a political force when, with the help of a massive media campaign, it overwhelmingly defeated Proposition 174, the voucher initiative.
Sound like a bright idea?
That's when California realized the political clout of the CTA.
Crowded schools?
About the mid-90s, we decided we need to let California know that we have the largest classrooms in the nation.
Public schools now have larger classes.
And we went back to our commercials. Our theme was, no child can succeed alone.
No child succeeds alone.
And the people start saying, wait a minute, I didn't know we were having these kinds of problems in public education. You need to do something about them, Governor Wilson. And all at once, Governor Wilson started listening and hearing. And he said, you know what? That's my issue. I'm going to reduce classes. And everybody in the world took credit for class size reduction, but we knew it was the California Teachers Association.
Last Christmas, I got a Christmas card from a young lady who now lives in Florida. She wanted me to know that she still remembered a class I taught at Hamilton High School. Something that was said or done in that class had made a change in her life. And she wanted to thank me for what had happened in my class some 30 years ago. So I was very touched by that. I know we talk a lot and we're concerned about salaries and retirement and fringe benefits and teacher militancy. But when you come right down to it, you have a chance to touch the life of some young person. And there's nothing more important.
A century ago, the high school graduation rate was less than 3%. CTA and public schools were in their infancy. Today's graduation rate has escalated to more than 83%. The 21st century will bring challenges, but CTA will continue to lead the fight for real educational reform. It will fight to improve working conditions, to involve teachers in all decisions that affect the classroom, to give first and second year teachers due process rights. It will strive for adequate education funding and the resources to make our schools the best in the nation. And CTA will fight for the 6 million kids who depend on teachers. Why? Because teachers make the public school system work.